The night the Prince of Darkness met royalty, and nothing was ever the same. The air was electric at Wembley Stadium that humid July night in 2015. 70,000 screaming fans packed into the legendary venue, their voices creating a wall of sound that could probably be heard all the way to Birmingham. Ozzy Osbourne stood backstage, leather pants tight, sunglasses firmly in place despite the darkness, his signature cross dangling from his neck. He took a swig of water, just water these days, he'd remind everyone, and cracked his knuckles. This was it, the biggest comeback show of his career. 5 minutes, Mr. Osbourne. The stage manager called out, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. Ozzy nodded, that familiar grin spreading across his face. After all these years, after all the chaos, the controversy, the headlines that screamed about bats and doves and every crazy thing in between, he was still here. Still standing, still ready to blow the roof off this place. His band was already on stage, the opening riff of Bark at the Moon, beginning to echo through the massive speakers. The crowd's roar intensified, a primal sound that made the ground vibrate beneath his feet. But then something strange happened. As Ozzy stepped toward the stage entrance, ready to make his grand appearance, his tour manager Danny rushed up to him with a phone pressed against his ear, his face pale as a ghost. Now, Danny had been with Ozzy for 15 years. He'd seen it all, the good shows, the disasters, the technical failures, the surprise guest appearances. Nothing rattled Danny. But right now, Danny looked like he'd seen the actual devil himself. What could possibly shake a man who'd survived decades in the rock and roll circus? Ozzy, we have a situation, Danny whispered, pulling him aside into the shadows backstage. What kind of situation? Ozzy asked, his Birmingham accent thick with concern. As the pyro broken again. Because I told you, mate, I'm not going on without the flames. The flames, it's not the pyro, Danny interrupted, wiping sweat from his forehead. It's bigger than pyro. Ozzy stared at him. Bigger than pyro. What could be bigger than pyro at a rock concert? The band was already playing, the intro extending longer than planned. The crowd getting more frenzied by the second. He could hear them chanting his name. O-Z-Z-Y! O-Z-Z-Y! It was intoxicating, that sound. It was why he did this. Why he'd always done this. Danny, just spit it out, mate. You're starting to worry me. Danny took a deep breath, looked around to make sure no one else could hear, and leaned in close. Queen Elizabeth is here. She's in the venue, right now. Ozzy blinked. Once, twice. Then he laughed, that high-pitched, unmistakable Ozzy laugh that had become as famous as his music. Good one, Danny. You almost had me there. Now seriously, what's the problem? I'm not joking, Ozzy. Her Majesty the Queen is in the building. She made an unannounced visit. Something about wanting to understand modern British culture, or some royal documentary thing. Her security detail is here, MI5 is crawling all over the place. And they're asking if you can acknowledge her presence. The laughter died in Ozzy's throat. Could the Queen of England really be standing in his audience, about to watch him perform? For a moment, Ozzy just stood there, frozen in the dim backstage area, the sounds of his own band playing without him, creating a surreal soundtrack to this impossible situation. The Queen. The Queen. The woman whose face was on every pound note, every stamp, the living symbol of Britain itself, was somewhere in this venue full of head-banging metalheads, waiting to watch him. Ozzy Osbourne, the man who'd bitten the head off a bat, who'd been banned from San Antonio, who'd urinated on the Alamo, perform. Where is she? Ozzy finally managed to ask. Royal box, left side of the stage. They set her up there about 10 minutes ago. Very quietly, very quickly. The crowd doesn't know yet, but security is going insane trying to keep things under control. Ozzy ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. This was beyond surreal. This was beyond anything even his wildest drug-fueled days could have conjured up. He thought about all those years ago, when he was just a kid from Aston, poor as dirt, dreaming of making it big. And now the Queen was here to watch him, the actual Queen. What do they want me to do? He asked. They're saying it's your call. You can acknowledge her, or you can just do the show normally. But Ozzy, Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. This could be huge. This could be historic. When has the Queen ever attended a rock concert? Never. This is unprecedented. The intro was looping now, the guitarist throwing in extra solos to buy time. Ozzy could feel the weight of 70,000 people waiting, their anticipation building to a fever pitch. And somewhere in that sea of humanity, in a private box with more security than Fort Knox, sat Queen Elizabeth II. What would you do if you were Ozzy in that moment? Play it cool or make history? Ozzy made his decision in a heartbeat. Get me a microphone that can reach the crowd before I go on. And tell the lighting guy to be ready for my signal. Danny's eyes widened. You're going to? I'm going to do what any proper British gentleman would do, mate. I'm going to acknowledge Her Majesty, but I'm going to do it my way." 3 minutes later, Ozzy Osbourne walked onto that stage, and the stadium exploded. The noise was deafening, a tsunami of pure sound and energy. People were jumping, screaming, crying, holding up signs, throwing the devil horns, waving British flags. The lights were blinding, the stage enormous, and Ozzy felt that familiar rush of adrenaline that never got old, no matter how many times he'd experienced it. But instead of launching into the first song, instead of doing what everyone expected, Ozzy walked to the center of the stage and held up his hand. The signal. The lights came up slightly, brightening the venue just enough that people could see each other, could see the stage clearly, and slowly, remarkably, the crowd began to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ozzy's voice boomed through the speakers, "we have a very special guest here tonight." A murmur ran through the crowd. Special guest? Who? Another rock legend. A surprise appearance. "Now, I know you all came here to see a rock and roll show," Ozzy continued, pacing the stage like a caged animal, his energy palpable even in the relative stillness. "And you're going to get one, I promise you that. But first, I need to tell you something that's just, well, it's bloody mental, really." Could this really be happening, or was it all an elaborate setup? Ozzy pointed toward the royal box, where a spotlight suddenly illuminated a small, dignified figure in a pale blue outfit, pearls around her neck, standing with perfect posture. Queen Elizabeth II. The camera feeds on the massive screens confirmed it. This was no look-alike, no joke. This was the real deal. The stadium went completely silent. 70,000 people, who moments before had been the loudest crowd in London, suddenly made no sound at all. You could have heard a pin drop on that stage. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in this impossible moment where punk rock royalty met actual royalty. "Your Majesty," Ozzy said, and to everyone's shock, he actually bowed. Not a full formal bow, this was still Ozzy Osbourne, after all, but a respectful nod of the head, a gesture that acknowledged the presence of someone whose family had ruled Britain for generations. "It is an honor and a privilege to have you here tonight. I never thought a kid from Aston would grow up to perform for the Queen herself." The Queen, visible on the massive screens, smiled slightly and gave a small wave. The crowd remained frozen, unsure how to react, caught between their love for Ozzy and their respect for the monarch, between rock and roll rebellion and British tradition. "Now," Ozzy continued, his voice taking on that mischievous tone that his fans knew all too well, "I have to tell you, Your Majesty, that this show might get a bit loud. There might be some language, there might be some theatrics, but it's all in good fun, and it's all for these beautiful people who've come here tonight to forget their troubles and just rock out." He turned back to the crowd, his arms spread wide. "So what do you say? Should we give Her Majesty a proper rock and roll welcome? Would the crowd embrace this bizarre moment, or would the whole thing fall apart?" For a split second, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, tense and uncertain, and then, like a dam breaking, the crowd erupted, not with their usual wild screaming, but with something different. A thunderous cheer mixed with applause, respectful but passionate, acknowledging both the Queen's presence and their excitement for the show ahead. British flags waved throughout the stadium alongside Black Sabbath banners. It was a moment of unity, bizarre and beautiful and completely unprecedented. The Queen, caught on camera, was smiling more broadly now, even giving a small nod of approval. Her security detail looked less pleased. They stood rigid, eyes constantly scanning, hands near concealed weapons. But the monarch herself seemed genuinely amused by the whole situation. "Right then," Ozzy said, turning back to his band. "Let's give Her Majesty and everyone else here a show they'll never forget." "Hit it!" The opening riff of "Bark at the Moon" exploded through the speakers, and Wembley Stadium transformed back into the rock and roll temple it was meant to be. But something was different now. There was an extra charge in the air, an awareness that this wasn't just another concert. This was history being made, captured on thousands of phones, destined to be talked about for decades to come. Ozzy performed like a man possessed that night. He ran across the stage, he screamed the lyrics with the same passion he'd had at 20, he engaged with the crowd, he made jokes between songs. And through it all, in that royal box, Queen Elizabeth watched with what appeared to be genuine interest. She didn't headbang, of course. That would have been too much to hope for. But she didn't leave either. She stayed for 5 songs, watching this legendary performer do what he did best. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. During Crazy Train, right at the climactic moment when the entire stadium was singing along, movement in the royal box caught Ozzy's attention. The Queen was standing, and for a moment, panic flashed through his mind. Was she leaving? Had he offended her somehow? Had the volume been too much, the content too inappropriate? But she wasn't leaving. She was standing and watching, her hand keeping time with the music in the smallest, most subtle way. It was barely noticeable, just a slight movement of her fingers against her dress, but it was there. The Queen of England was tapping along to FICTIONAL. Ozzy nearly stopped singing. Nearly forgot the words entirely. But decades of professional experience kicked in, and he kept going, his eyes occasionally darting to that royal box, hardly believing what he was seeing. The cameras caught it too, that tiny gesture, and the footage would later go viral, analyzed and debated and celebrated across social media for weeks. After FICTIONAL, the Queen gave one final wave to the crowd, who responded with respectful applause, and then she departed, her security detail surrounding her like a protective cocoon. The show went on for another hour and a half, but everyone knew that the first 20 minutes would be what people remembered, what would define this night. Backstage after the show, soaked in sweat and running on pure adrenaline, Ozzy was met by a representative from the palace. The man was young proper, his suit immaculate despite the chaos of the backstage area. "Monsieur Osborne," he said formally, "Her Majesty wanted me to convey her gratitude for your hospitality and performance tonight. She found it enlightening." What do you think lightning meant coming from the Queen? Was she impressed or just being polite? Ozzy laughed, that same disbelieving laugh from earlier in the evening. "Enlightening. Mate, I've been called a lot of things in my life, but enlightening is a new one." The representative allowed himself a small smile. "She also wanted me to give you this." He handed Ozzy an envelope sealed with an official-looking stamp. Inside was a handwritten note on official royal stationery. The handwriting was elegant, precise, unmistakably from another era. "Mr. Osborne, thank you for a memorable evening and for demonstrating that British culture continues to evolve in unexpected and vigorous ways. Your passion for your craft was evident, as was the devotion of your audience. Perhaps there is more that unites us across generations than divides us. With appreciation, Elizabeth R." Ozzy stared at the note for a long moment, then carefully folded it and put it in his pocket. "Sharon's never going to believe this," he muttered. But Sharon did believe it, because the entire thing had been captured on video. By the next morning, Ozzy and the Queen was trending worldwide. News outlets from every country covered the story. The footage of the Queen tapping along to Crazy Train became one of the most watched videos of the year. Think pieces were written about the meeting of high and low culture, about the Queen's final years of public appearances, about Ozzy's enduring legacy. Some people loved it, calling it a perfect example of British eccentricity and the Queen's willingness to engage with all aspects of her nation's culture. Others thought it was undignified for both parties. But most people just found it delightfully bizarre, the kind of story that could only happen in reality. Except this time it was fiction masquerading as reality, or was it reality masquerading as fiction? If you could ask Ozzy one question about that night, what would it be? In the days that followed, Ozzy gave dozens of interviews about the experience. Late-night talk shows flew him out for exclusive conversations. Magazine covers featured split images of him and the Queen side by side. The story took on a life of its own, growing and evolving with each retelling. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Ozzy told one interviewer leaning back in his chair, more reflective than usual. "We're not that different, really. Both of us spent our whole lives in the public eye, doing a job we were kind of born into. Both of us had to deal with people constantly judging us, criticizing us, expecting us to be something we might not always want to be. Obviously, her job was way more important than mine," he added quickly, "but there's a similarity there. If you think about it." The interviewer pressed him, "Did it change how you see yourself, having the Queen attend your show?" Ozzy thought about that for a moment. "It reminded me that I'm still that kid from Aston, you know. Still that working-class kid who couldn't believe his luck when he got to travel the world and play music for people. And if that kid could grow up to perform for the Queen of England, then anything's possible, isn't it? That's what I want people to take from this. That you never know where life's going to take you." Back at Wembley Stadium, a plaque was eventually installed backstage, commemorating the night of July 23, 2015, when Queen Elizabeth II attended an Ozzy Osbourne concert. Tour guides on stadium tours would point it out, telling the story to wide-eyed visitors who could hardly believe it was true. Did this fictional encounter change anything real, or was it just an entertaining fantasy? The answer to that question depended on who you asked. For Ozzy, it became one of his favorite stories to tell, a tale that grew slightly more embellished with each retelling, as all good stories do. For British rock fans, it became a point of pride, proof that their culture could contain both the ancient traditions of the monarchy and the rebellious spirit of rock and roll. For the monarchy, it was a reminder that remaining relevant meant engaging with all aspects of modern life, even the loud, chaotic, unpredictable parts. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the people who heard the story, whether they believed it actually happened or not. It sparked conversations about class, culture, respect, and the unexpected ways that different worlds can collide. It made people think about the assumptions they made about others based on appearances or backgrounds. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, we're all more connected than we think. In the months that followed, Ozzy received letters from fans all over the world, sharing what the story meant to them. A young musician from Liverpool wrote about how it inspired him to pursue his dreams, no matter how unlikely they seemed. A retired teacher from Manchester wrote about showing the footage to her class and discussing how British culture had evolved over the decades. A military veteran wrote about how the image of Ozzy bowing to the Queen, showing respect while still being himself, had moved him deeply. These letters Ozzy kept in a special box in his home office. Next to them, framed on the wall, was that handwritten note from Queen Elizabeth. Sharon had insisted on framing it, despite Ozzy's protests that it seemed too formal, too much like showing off. "It's history, Ozzy," she told him. "Our grandchildren will want to see this someday. Would you frame a letter from the Queen, or would that feel too much like bragging?" As years passed, the story of that night became the stuff of legend. New fans discovering Ozzy's music would inevitably come across the footage online and watch in amazement. "Is this real?" they'd ask in the comments. "Did this actually happen?" And the responses would be a mix of believers and skeptics, people swearing it was real and others insisting it was an elaborate hoax or a fictional tale beautifully told. The truth, as is often the case, existed somewhere in the space between fact and fiction, between what happened and what we wish had happened. It was a story that felt true, even if it wasn't. It captured something essential about both Ozzy and the Queen, about Britain itself, about the unexpected moments that define our lives. Ozzy himself became increasingly philosophical about the whole thing as he got older. In an interview on his 70th birthday, he was asked about his favorite moment from his entire career. People expected him to talk about Black Sabbath's early days or the solo hits or the reality TV show. Instead, he talked about that night at Wembley. "You spend your whole career chasing moments," he said, his voice more measured than in his younger days. "Moments where everything comes together perfectly, where something real and true happens in the midst of all the performance and production. That night at Wembley, whether you believe it happened exactly as I tell it or not, that was one of those moments. It was a reminder that music, real music, played with passion and honesty, can bring anyone together, even a prince of darkness and a queen." The interviewer smiled at that, but pressed further. "Some people say that story is too perfect, too unlikely to be true. What do you say to the skeptics? What do you think Ozzy's response was? Did he defend the story's truth or embrace the mystery?" Ozzy grinned, that familiar mischievous glint returning to his eyes. "I say believe what you want to believe. That's what rock and roll is all about, isn't it? It's about creating moments that feel real, that move people, that mean something. Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the feeling is real, the magic is real, and at the end of the day that's what matters." It was a perfect non-answer, the kind of response that kept the legend alive, that allowed people to choose their own truth. Some would always believe it happened exactly as described. The surprise visit, the royal acknowledgement, the note, all of it. Others would see it as a beautiful fiction, a story that captured something essential about British culture and the enduring power of unexpected connections. But everyone agreed on one thing: it was a great story. The kind of story that gets told and retold, that brings smiles and sparks imagination, that makes people think differently about the world and the people in it. And isn't that what the best stories do, regardless of their basis in fact? That night at Wembley Stadium, real, imagined, or something in between, became part of rock and roll mythology. It joined the ranks of other legendary concert moments: Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire, Queen at Live Aid, Woodstock, the Beatles on the rooftop. It became a story that defined not just Ozzy's career but an entire era of cultural evolution. Years later, documentarians would try to verify every detail, to separate fact from fiction. They'd interview everyone who was supposedly there, analyze footage, check security records. Some claimed to have been in the audience that night, describing it in vivid detail. Others insisted it never happened at all, that no official records existed of the Queen attending any rock concert. In a world where we can never be certain what's true anymore, does it matter if this story really happened? The question lingered, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. But the story persisted, passed down from generation to generation, adapted and changed with each telling while maintaining its essential core. The night Ozzy Osbourne stopped his concert because Queen Elizabeth walked in, and the crowd froze in a moment that transcended music, monarchy, and expectation. In the end, maybe the truth of the story wasn't in its factual accuracy, but in its emotional resonance. It was a story about respect and rebellion existing simultaneously, about tradition meeting innovation, about the unexpected connections that can form when we're open to possibilities we never imagined, about a working-class kid from Birmingham and a queen who'd lived through world wars and seen her nation transform, finding a moment of mutual recognition in the controlled chaos of a rock concert. And that, perhaps, was worth more than any verification or debunking could ever provide. So what do you think? Did it really happen, or is the beauty in the story itself, regardless of its truth?